Good afternoon and welcome to the first webinar in our series of webinars focused on Indigenous philanthropy, filling the void towards self-determination. So my name is Trea StormHunter and I'm a PhD student at the University of Manitoba in Natural Resources and Environmental Land Management. So our guest speakers today are Goddard from the Winnipeg Foundation, Chief Orville Smoke and Craig Blacksmith from Dakota Plains, Wahpeton, Oyate. So this webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared on our Indigenous Philanthropy website within the next 4 days after we do some video editing. And I'm super excited in the response and interest received in the area of Indigenous philanthropy. And I strongly feel that this is a real important pathway towards Indigenous self-determination and filling the gaps. So the agenda today is as follows. We're going to have a presentation from Goddard. We're going to have a presentation from Craig Blacksmith and Chief Orville Smoke. We're going to open the floor for questions and discussion, and then we'll do some closing remarks and information for our next webinar. So just a brief introduction about the Indigenous Philanthropy Engagement Project. So this project is hoping to explore optimal solutions to solve community challenges through the Community Foundation model approach. So in collaboration with rural First Nation communities in Manitoba, the goal is to advance Indigenous development and community capacity building through community-led development initiatives. So the project primarily focuses on building progressive partnerships and collaborations with Manitoba rural Indigenous communities to move them towards self-determination and understand how First Nation communities can be appropriately engaged in the Community Foundation movement. So in looking at the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the Canadian Community Foundation's philanthropic community has committed to addressing and removing the barriers and gaps related to the lack of Indigenous-led foundations. So currently, Indigenous people account for about 18% of Manitoba's population, yet Indigenous-focused charities only make up about 1.8% of the total number of core charities in the province. And then furthermore, while Manitoba leads the nation in the Community Foundation movement, only 3% of Indigenous charity revenues can be traced back to gifts from philanthropic foundations. So the project is to better understand the relationship between Manitoba's Community Foundation movement and the interests of rural Indigenous communities. And so I think that this knowledge is very important in facilitating opportunities and establishing sustainable partnerships and collaborations. So ideally, this research, the research questions that I'm wanting to answer is, what are the real and perceived barriers and challenges that are inhibiting greater collaboration between rural Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in Manitoba? What are the visions, resources, and supports required in rural Indigenous communities to develop sustainable Indigenous-led endowment funds? And how can an Indigenous-led endowment fund build Indigenous social enterprise that focuses on sustainable development and environmental management for rural Indigenous communities? So furthermore, I am hoping that this community-led empowerment approach for Indigenous communities can also be used as a model or a framework for community foundations in other provinces to design and implement Indigenous-led endowment funds. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Goddard from the Winnipeg Foundation. So thank you for joining.
I'm just going to hope that KSAB is going to put up the PowerPoint and then I can speak to it. But thank you so much, Trea, for having me. We're obviously very interested in this initiative, bearing in mind all of the great work that has been done already in Indigenous philanthropy research and hoping to build on that. Probably the first question that we need to address, given the incredible array of individuals participating in this inaugural webinar is getting at the heart of, what is a community foundation? I have a long history of working in the, public, private, and not-for-profit sector. And I would argue that the community foundation and the definition of it, what it is probably one of the most confusing or often misunderstood concepts. So the definition, right from the Community Foundations of Canada, or umbrella organization at the national level, their definition is simply a community foundation is a registered charity and independent public foundation. However, unlike most registered charities that define themselves through generally a fairly specific mission or mandate, community foundations have broad mandates that revolve around a singular notion, and that's supporting a community's well-being now and into the future. And unlike many charitable organizations or charities, a community foundation, its mandate essentially requires that as long as a community exists, their community foundation's mission will never be finished. Because regardless of what level of community is at, regardless of their needs, they're always going to exist, and there's always going to be that necessity or that willingness or desire to improve the well-being of its citizens. So how do they work? In general, community foundations are known for bringing donors together in the sense of pooling their collective resources to gain a better understanding from both the community and the donor's perspective of what those community priorities are, what they need, and ultimately to provide grant to those organizations that best address those needs. Now, there's many ways of doing that collective community foundation giving. There are flow-throughs where donors simply provide gifts that go directly to organizations or priorities that would benefit from them. There are capital campaigns where donors pool resources together to take on a specific project, such as the establishment of a care home or a hospital or another recreation or capital program. There is spend down, where those resources from donors are pooled to get to a certain level, and then over years, the total capital contributed, that total amount of gifts, are slowly spent over the years until there's nothing left. Obviously, again, in support of a specific priority or organization. And then lastly, there are permanent endowments, which are legally known as trusts. And those are really where I want to focus on. So permanent endowments, trusts. They are the traditional form of wealth management or asset management in the community foundation movement. They are by no means the only, but specifically in Manitoba, it is what I would argue is the primary form or means. What it does or how it works is that essentially the contributed capital, so that's the total of all the donations made to this specific trust or specific fund, are permanently held or vested by the community foundation. Those funds are then invested in the market in various ways, and the manner in which the money is distributed to the community is that every year the interest or dividends that come from those investments, that come from that permanent trust, is used to create spending or grants. So based on Canadian government CRA regulations, so Canada Revenue Agency regulations, a minimum of 3.5% of the total value of the trust must be granted out annually. And most community foundations in Canada do more than 3.5%. The remaining interest or any dividends that are made from that kind of annual growth is either used to pay for community foundation operational costs or reinvested back into the trust, back into the fund, so that it grows over time, so it's constantly retaining its net present value. What's important about this and how it differs from many other forms of giving is that the principal is never spent. So it can feasibly, that fund properly managed can feasibly last forever, with only the dividends being used to support community priorities and charitable organizations. Of the permanent endowment types that community foundations normally manage or deal with, there are the donor advised, which, just as they sound, are trusts that are set up with the expectation and the opportunity for donors to advise the community foundation on which charities or priorities they would like to see their dividends or grants paid out to. There are agency funds, which are normally established by a specific charitable organization for the intent and purpose, the only purpose of supporting themselves, usually to help with either larger strategies and or even fairly regular operational requirements. There's scholarships, which is pretty self-explanatory. There's field of interest, which is a type of endowment or trust whereby a whole bunch of pooled funds that fall within a general field or cause are used to then pay out to grants in that general field or cause area. Normally, those payments and the decision and the determination of where those grants to are still made by the Community Foundations Board and or a grants committee made up of interested community members. But in all cases, the funds are generally meant to be spent within those specific fields. And last but not least is what we consider unrestricted, undesignated, or community funds. And those are funds that are populated by grants from people all across Manitoba, all across communities, from all walks of life. And they're pooled into kind of a single collective amount whereby the total interest and funds that come from it, the payments that come from it, are decided by the community foundation responsively to address current and future community needs or priorities. So having explained sort of community foundations and how they operate, I want to talk a little bit about who we are in Endow, Manitoba. And in order to do that, I first want to talk a little bit about the history of community foundations in Manitoba. So in 1921, the Winnipeg Foundation was launched as Canada's first community foundation. And then from there, the movement spread throughout Canada. And, we see foundations and participants today representing foundations from all across Canada and other jurisdictions. For the longest time in Manitoba, we had roughly, I would say 10 to 12 foundations leading up into the 1990s, where a then challenge by the Governor General of Canada that every community should have a community foundation was taken on by the Thomas Sill Foundation, another public foundation in Manitoba, who challenged all of our communities here to establish their own community foundation as a means to independently sustain and grow themselves. And the way they did it, they simply said to every municipality out there, if you can raise $200,000 on your own, we'll match that with another $100,000 and support you becoming a community foundation. So you can imagine, from having roughly a dozen community foundations in the 1980s, the Thomas Sill Foundation helped launch and grow to nearly 56 community foundations now, which is the largest number of community foundations in a single Canadian jurisdiction, and possibly and probably the largest number per capita in North America. So you consider how large Manitoba is from a population base, and then just imagine 56 community foundations operating to date, which is, of course, growing. The need for Endow Manitoba. The Winnipeg Foundation has a long-running history of supporting Manitoba community foundation movements dating all the way back to the 1980s. With the rapid growth of the movement in the 1990s onward, they responded by creating various programs aimed at supporting what we would consider hyper-local community foundations without impacting their independence. Our CEO has a famous saying where he believes that the rising tide floats all boats. That is absolutely true in the case of community foundations. And in 2018, the Winnipeg Foundation kind of combined all of those programs, combined all of those projects under a single entity, the Winnipeg Foundation. Our mandate specifically is to sustain or to advance the sustainability and growth of Manitoba's community foundation movement. We do that by supporting existing CFs through grants, programming, and shared resources. We support communities to establish and grow their own CFs. We engage municipal, provincial, and federal stakeholders in the Manitoba Community Foundation movement, but we are always grounded by a servant leadership philosophy. We only do what is asked of us, and we respond similarly. There can never be a singular Manitoba Community Foundation because the strengths of the networked model of having so many community foundations operating autonomously and with self-determination in their communities is what we believe the way forward. So why are we supporting the research project? Trea mentioned some of the rationale, but I just want to cover a few important things. The first is what I consider our truths and where we are now. So the Manitoba Community Foundation movement has now grown to nearly 1.5 billion in assets, and I would hazard a guess that within 5 years, that sum will exceed 2 billion and will just keep growing exponentially. These are permanent trusts, providing the communities that own those assets greater autonomy and resources and self-determination to provide for their own well-being forever. Just this year in Manitoba, those assets will create $70 million in grants to support the Manitoba charitable sector and other priorities. The other truth is that Manitoba is home to 63 First Nations, and Indigenous people make up an 18% and growing percentage of our provincial population. And while there has been tremendous growth and activity in this area, as it relates to Manitoba Community Foundation support and collaboration with Indigenous communities, organizations, priorities, there are no Indigenous-led and owned community foundations or owned community foundations in Manitoba, nor has there been a global provincial effort to better align the community foundation movement with the needs of Indigenous communities, and again, at the global provincial level. So we can't talk about truth without talking about reconciliation. And here's earnestly what I hope to see at the conclusion of this research, and again, in line with what we've seen from other research in Indigenous philanthropy and community foundation work. It's for us to learn. First and foremost, how to better engage, support, and be an ally to Indigenous people, how to create space for Indigenous communities to join the community foundation movement, and that's if they want in a way that matches their values and needs, and from an Endow Manitoba perspective, how to create programs and opportunities that will enable that path. I can share with you, and this will be announced probably within the next couple of months, if not sooner, that as part of this program and in support of this research, we will be launching a community fund matching program by year end, which we hope to tie to the outcomes of the research and in line with the learnings that we gain from this. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present. Merci and miigwech.
Okay, thank you, Alan, for sharing, your view and where the Winnipeg Foundation and Endow Manitoba is going. Our next speakers. So I'm going to have Chief Orville Smoke and Craig Blacksmith from Dakota Plains, Wahpeton, Oyate. Share some of their words, and then we will leave time for about 20 minutes for some questioning. So Chief Smoke and Craig will speak for about the next 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll get to the discussion questions. Thank you. Oh, yeah, there. Okay, good.
I don't think we're muted. Thanks, Alan, for that presentation. That's something that we've been attempting to do as an Indian reserve, and I don't think people really understand what it means to be under this Indian Act, because every time we try and do something outside of the contribution agreement, we're met with derision and people basically slammed doors in our faces. And Chief Smoke has been part of the system since 1971. That was the year before the contribution agreement started. And if people aren't familiar with contribution agreements, that's the funding that's allocated to the Indian reserves from Indian Affairs. And so there was a little bit of negotiation at the outset, but in 1984, with the passing of Bill C-31, the funding was capped in 1984. So Indian reserves in Canada received the same amount of funding that they used to in 1984 in 2020. And so the history of Dakota Plains is unique in that Dakota Plains has a recorded history all the way back to the late 1800s. And in 1890, Dakota Plains purchased property in Portage. And whereas all the other Indians were receiving treaty land bases, the government, Canadian government at the time, didn't consider Dakotas Indians. And instead they placed a refugee status on us. And so the people, and these are Chief Smoke's grandparents, they purchased their own property. And this was in 1890. And the recorded history shows that the Indian agents, through correspondence to Canada, that Dakota Plains did not require anything from the government. And so there was no financial or land allocations from the government to Dakota Plains. So what happened in 1911 was the city of Portage passed a resolution wanting the Indians removed from their present location. And again, the letters from the Indian agents depicting the Dakotas as having equal to or better homes than the surrounding townspeople, self-sufficiency, gardens, flower gardens, the whole works, flew in the face of this resolution, because the resolution stated that because of immorality and drunkenness and kids not having anything to do after school, that this was the reasoning for removing the Dakotas from their location. So even though they purchased their own property, Dakota Plains was moved to its present location. So it went from self-sustaining to dependency, and this is what the Indian Act does to the Indian reserves. It's economic sanctions. So when Dakota Plains was moved out to its present location, even up till 1956, Dakota Plains was not dependent on the government. They cleared the land, they farmed, they took care of themselves. And then the Indian agents came out, restricted all the economic development, and any produce, anything that was marketable by the Dakotas had to go to the Indian agent. The Indian agent in turn would broker the sale and purchase of things, and basically gave the people a small allowance. And so after a few years of this, he would purchase seeds late in the spring. So then conversely, during the fall, the Dakotas were the last ones to take their crops off, and after frost and everything else, that self-sustainability was gone, and rations were brought to the community. So it's a sordid history, and sadly that Indian Act is still in existence today. So we're very limited with what we can do. And so this community foundation having a charitable tax status will allow us to to access funding from philanthropists and corporate entities that want to help Chief Smoke and his people. So we're very encouraged by this, and I'd like to acknowledge Trea, who I knew from a mutual acquaintance, and for one reason or another, we're part and parcel to this. So that's Dakota Plains in a nutshell, from a kind of like from a historical legal perspective.
Good morning or good afternoon. I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to have a discussion on my people. I've been with bureaucracy, working with governments since 1972 and before. And it's one of the greatest obstacles to become a human being and to demonstrate that we're capable. And we did it several times. And thankfully, we're not treaty. It's recognized by the governments, and we're working on recognition. But in order to do that, I think we have to keep my people alive. And to do that, we need some kind of consideration from a non-bureaucratic organization that recognizing genocide to many of our First Nation people. And basically, it's a trek for survival. As far as my people are concerned, there's others that are treated who have land entitlement monies. They're able to do certain projects that would help them survive. In our case, we have absolutely nothing other than what we can earn. We are the bottom rung of the federal government, and no recognition from the province, and we're working on being a private entity apart away from those types of offices and entities. With that, thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chief Smoke, and thank you, Craig Blacksmith, for sharing about Dakota Plains and about the history and about the current struggles or barriers and challenges. There is a lot of community strengths. I'll just say one more thing before we go into the question and discussion period, because there's some really good questions on there. Is Dakota Wahpeton is located about 2 hours outside of Winnipeg and quite close to Portage La Prairie. It is, you know, I think when speaking with Craig yesterday, he says it's right off the main highway, but you would actually think that they were in the middle of nowhere because a lot of people can't find their way out to it, but they have excellent, like it's not that far off the main highway. So in moving forward, I would like to look at some of the questions. I think I'd like to start with Sharon Red Sky. If we could unmute Sharon, because she has some really great questions that she has put into the group chat. So I'll put the floor to you, Sharon.
Bonjour. I just want to acknowledge Chief Smoke and for your strength and your resiliency. You do so much, not only for your community, but for a lot of people. And I just want to, you know, from my heart, just acknowledge you and your work. And so I did have a lot of questions. I think it's really important to acknowledge that a lot of the wealth that community foundations have been able to start has been on the backs of Indigenous communities. And so some of my questions regarding that is, how do people get appointed to the boards, to those foundations? Because, you know, I don't think enough Indigenous people are at the tables where decisions are being made. So that would be the important piece. And the most important thing that I've seen, because there was that report in 2017 where in Manitoba, you're right, that only, you know, 2%, less than 2% went to Indigenous-led organizations. And I think there's also a lot of information that needs to get out there about qualified donees. because a lot of, you know, First Nation communities, with the exception of Dakota Plains, sorry, you know, don't have to get charitable status. And so I think, you know, that's important. But community foundations do not fund fundraisers. So that is a big challenge in a lot of our Indigenous-led organizations and qualified donees, and it's a barrier. And so I think those are some really important things that need to change. So that was a lot.
Alan, do you want to take a stab at that one and unmute yourself?
I am happy to take a stab at it. That was, thank you, Sharon, for your honesty with asking those questions. We can talk about decolonizing wealth. We can talk about the interest in the movement at looking at, talking about, and taking action as it relates to wealth redistribution. But those are like larger, bigger conversations. I would say right now, what I can commit to answering is first on the governance. So community foundation boards, or community foundations in general, are primarily set up through an application process, through engagement with CRA and making sure that they've done everything correctly. But to say that there's one specific governance model, you know, I work with all 56 community foundations in Manitoba, and I would argue that not a single one has an identical governance model to another. Generally, what I do see, though, is either a municipal or local government-led entity that helps set up the community foundation, and then it is populated either by an arm's length volunteer board, or it's completely separate entity, but once again, it's a volunteer board that selects its own members, usually for terms of like, well, generally the recommendation is 2 to 3 years, but there are definitely community foundations out there who have had the same boards and the same people around the table for 5, 10, sometimes longer. And so the matter of how do you make room at the table? Part of it is definitely around governance. Part of it is definitely around making sure that community foundation boards are more inclusive. And by that, we don't just mean that there's turnover, but that there's active efforts in engaging Indigenous people in board roles.
Thank you, Alan, for that. Did that somehow answer your question, Sharon?
Yeah, I noticed Craig is
Waving.
Yeah, but I did wonder, Alan, will community foundations, you know, as your role, ever have the opportunity to, you know, look at a strategy that could, you know, assist in building the capacity?
Absolutely. Like, you know, we talk about whether, to me, the biggest challenge is dealing with the CRA and what I would consider systemic barriers to engaging Indigenous communities, specifically the qualified donee issue. That, I would say, is just as big of a priority for the Manitoba Community Foundation movement in order to move forward in this priority, as is supporting capacity building. We do it for other organizations, so I can't imagine why we wouldn't do it for Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led organizations. I can think of so many examples where we support agencies, we support managed funds, flow-throughs. Right now, what we've done this year, and what I hope to see more of, is we have targeted, and it's not an immaterial amount, but we've targeted roughly $120,000 a year, which I hope to use to create matching programs or stretch programs for those communities who may not have community foundations, but want to set up community funds as a first step towards creating those permanent assets, as a first step towards building capacity towards a community foundation. That is already in the works. The only thing I'm waiting on is the work that we're doing, and Trea is doing, and the learnings from it to make sure that when that rolls out, it's done in an authentic manner.
Oh. Thank you, Alan. So Craig, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see this.
Uh-huh. Community Foundation and Indian Reserve First Nations. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to answer Sharon's question, the community foundation that we're talking about here is going to be a separate entity from the reserve, but the foundation is going to be for the First Nation. The community foundation will have a charitable tax number, charitable status, so that just like the other community foundations that Alan's talking about, those community foundations are funded by philanthropists and corporations, right? So this community foundation that we're talking about here is going to be set up for the First Nation, because that charitable tax number is key. Corporations that fund these charitable tax, or I mean the charitable organizations or community foundations, that charitable tax number is what enables the corporations to fund them. Because a corporation has to pay taxes to the government. So if they pay $5 million in taxes to the government and they donate $500,000 to a hospital or a charity, they take that receipt, and instead of paying the government cash, they use that receipt to offset the expense of funding a community foundation. So to answer your question, this community foundation that's going to be set up for the reserve is going to be set up by the reserve or the First Nation, but it's for the First Nation. So the board of directors are going to be from this community. That's what this program is about. So I hope that kind of clarifies a little bit of it.
Yes, absolutely, that makes sense. It's just challenging that there isn't a lot of seed money to help develop those strategic plans to engage with the philanthropic sector. And so when I think about, you know, your initiative in particular, having somebody who can, you know, be out there to help you set up a planned giving, annual giving, all of those really important components. It's hard to find the funding to establish that. And I think it would be a game changer if there was a fund that would enable not just your community foundation, but other Indigenous led to do that kind of work. It would make a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah, and I 100% agree with you, Sharon. And this is new territory, so I'm so excited, you know, to be a part of that and bringing Indigenous communities together from all over to, you know, in this community foundation movement, because I think Indigenous philanthropy is key to filling those gaps. You know, we shouldn't have to, as our communities, rely solely on government funding, because there's all that red tape. So ideally, you know, this is going to be filling those gaps. So that's what I'm hoping, is that with setting up Indigenous-led endowment funds and having the community 100% responsible for those funds, like the community fund, and leading it, that other communities are going to join together, and that there will be then philanthropists that go, hey, you know, this is an area, and wow, look at what's happening here. And so yeah, I just wanted to respond to that. Now I see that Uriel had a question. If we wanted, I hope I pronounced the name right. Do you want to join in and talk, Uriel, and ask the question? Okay, I'll ask for. So Uriel had put, which percentage of the yearly 70 million, I think this is for Alan, into endowments of specific use? How much is endowed to Indigenous use, and how much could it grow from the non-assigned funds? Do you see that question there, Alan, in the chat box?
Short answer, not enough. Longer answer, The reality is that probably 10, 15 years ago, the permanent endowments, and therefore the vast majority of funds that came from said endowments, were discretionary. So they're undesignated. They were community funds, which allowed local community foundations to for the most part, set priorities and meet the needs of their communities by using those funds to be responsive. I would say since then, there's been a considerable surge in what we consider designated agency or donor advised funds, whereby community funds are becoming a much smaller or shrinking percentage of the funds or the assets under management by community foundation, which in turn reduces our capacity to be responsive and to react to the changing needs and priorities of our community's well-being. It's no different than in this situation, it's no different with Indigenous funds and philanthropy. That is an area that we haven't had grow, although it is becoming, at least in Manitoba, and I have heard in other jurisdictions across Canada as well, it is becoming a key priority for community foundations. I think what it comes down to is, as a community foundation movement in Manitoba, we've never had the opportunity to say, this is a priority for all of us. This is something we can do collaboratively. Every year we get together, and on the giving challenge held in November, we're able to raise over $1 million in new permanent assets. Now imagine if we could combine that concept with creating Indigenous focused community funds, where we could get the entire province around the idea of creating wealth, redistributing wealth back to Indigenous priorities in a permanent fashion.
And I think permanent is key. And I think we do have some people who joined us today that are from the Vancouver Foundation and in Toronto. And I'm not sure if anybody from another foundation would like to speak. I think Craig actually is from, yes. What is your kind of role or perception, and how funds are used for Indigenous philanthropy where you are?
Awesome questions, first of all, Sharon. Quick thanks to Alan, Craig, Chief Smoke for your participation today. Really appreciate it. And just quickly acknowledging that I am calling in from the far side of the country, traditional Coast Salish territory. I am the Vice President of Donor Services here at Vancouver Foundation, and have been very fortunate to be here for a little while now, just over a decade. We have seen lots of different initiatives. There is great energy around providing greater support to Indigenous and Black, not only Indigenous and Black serving organizations, but led organizations as well. We have taken a much closer look at, yes, where much of our endowed money has come from, and looking very closely at how we can potentially repurpose some of those to ensure that we are supporting vulnerable communities. We are starting, we have started an Indigenous-led and serving granting program specifically.
Nice.
It is one of the key priorities that we have when people are applying for grants from our discretionary pool. It's a specific question on our grant application. How are you serving Indigenous and BIPOC-led organizations? So it has become a great focus at Vancouver Foundation, most certainly. And I would say probably in the last 5 years, very much a lens that we are looking through in greater detail.
Mm. And I think one of the unique in BC, I grew up in Vancouver, is a lot of that is it's unceded territory, which is different than when you look at the numbered treaties in the prairies and the challenges that presents for the First Nations communities. So I think there's probably maybe not as much red tape, I would hypothesize out there. Yeah, for sure. Now, Dr.
The other piece that we are looking at is, as well, we recognize that the territory in which we are on, and making permanent grants to those organizations or to those local communities, those local First Nations, without any application process.
Oh, nice.
It's just part of what we will do moving forward. What percentage on an annual basis? I mean, that will be fluid because we don't know what our returns are like. We don't know how the markets will cooperate, et cetera. But something that we're also committed to.
That's awesome. That's excellent. Dr. Thompson, you had some questions that I see that are in the chat box. Would you like to ask? I'm not sure if she's there.
Hi.
There she is. Yes.
Okay. Yes. So with reconciliation and the obvious that community foundations are place-based and often centered where people have money, so that they kind of feed back into the communities, although they're serving, different needs and poverty, this sustainable development goals, I'm sure, is that they do not get to regional areas that are economically impoverished. So the community foundation model in itself, where it actually is funded locally, and as a result kind of feeds more wealthy communities and kind of starves the other communities. And what kind of forces can we use to equalize and reconcile?
Any takers on that question? Alan?
Absolutely. I think a question of like wealth redistribution, inequality, again, going back to like the conversation around decolonizing wealth and where that will lead us, is a priority for community foundations. Even, and I have to give incredible recognition to Rick Frost, my CEO at the Winnipeg Foundation, because through his leadership and of course through the leadership of the Winnipeg Foundation's board, even as early as the past decade, they dedicated 5% of their undesignated funds towards supporting rural community foundation development. And while that is currently benefiting the established community foundations, the 56 that are not Indigenous led, that type of thinking and the doors it opens is what I hope to see as we evolve and as we learn to partner and collaborate and to ally with Indigenous communities.
Yes, for sure. Because even like the other challenges or sometimes obstacles is when you look at the geographical location. A lot of our communities, in particular, our northern communities, will say, our flying communities are inaccessible by road, or you have to access them by winter roads, which presents some challenges in terms of educating and the people about how to effectively run or advise or sit on the board for an Indigenous-led endowment. So it's like bringing the education there and training them there. And then, with COVID, that's his whole other challenges that we don't need to get into in this discussion. But it is. But I think that what you said with that 5% going to the 56 non-Indigenous, I think that's definitely a possibility and something, and has high potential for First Nations throughout Canada, both in the numbered, peace and friendship, and unceded as well. So I'm just mindful of the time. It's 12:56. Does anybody else have any questions that they want to ask before we sign off? Craig.
We are very interested in developing or starting this this community foundation. So how long will it take us to get that, to achieve that charitable tax status?
So first we're doing we're doing the project and the study, and then you guys are then you will be setting up your advisory board. Then we'll be doing the training. So ideally, if I would like to have it set up within the next year, that would be like my goal, and have people trained if I could be so ambitious. But that would depend. So on the community and on the resources in play, and COVID is another crazy thing that we're dealing with. So Alan?
I was actually just going to point, I was going to point this out, and Sharon beat me to it in the chat session, but the biggest challenge with setting up community foundations is less the governance and the structure. And of course, as always, organizations like Endow Manitoba and the Community Foundations of Canada are there to support all communities in the establishment of a foundation. But the biggest issue I have found is always the red tape, and that red tape is at the federal level. It's basically the acceptance and the designation of registered charity through CRA. And my hope, as well as Sharon's, is that we're at a point now where they recognize the systemic inequity inherent to how most Canadian municipalities just have to ask for charitable status, and it's conferred upon them, while Indigenous communities have to put a lot more work in.
Mm-hmm.
And we're hoping they recognize that, and we're hoping, and we're not just hoping, because we're working obviously to address that as well, but we're hoping to see change. But until that change happens, we could do everything right, you could do everything right, and it's still a bureaucratic process.
Yes, Craig.
So, Alan, if we set up a community foundation that isn't technically by the First Nation, if we set up a community foundation that's in support of, but outside of the Indian Reserve red tape, because you're saying that foundations set up like outside of Indigenous are pretty quick. So would we be able to do that? Because we don't want this to be something that Indian Affairs can get their hands on.
Mm.
We want it separate, and we happen to meet an angel. we call it an angel investor. And so one of Chief's visions has always been to be self-sustainable. He doesn't want to be part of this Indian Act, right? So this angel investor purchased a piece of property for us in the city of Winnipeg, and the business isn't up and running yet, but it's going to be. And so the revenue generated by that business is not in any way tied to the reserve. So there's no, just think of, say, your local Tim Hortons. Who owns that Tim Hortons? Nobody knows, nobody cares. So the revenue generated by this entity is going to fund Dakota Plains, but it's not a direct tie. There's no, So that's the vision here for this community foundation, is that it is for Dakota Plains, but it's not tied to the reserve in any way.
I think
Alan, can you answer that, Alan?
I think that, hang on, Craig. I think that we could definitely answer that, but I'm just being mindful of the time, and it's 1 o'clock, but I think we would have to have a meeting outside of this one, and then we can directly answer that question.
But you know what? I just want to say that it's really important to acknowledge that your community could qualify as a qualified donee. So you can do that by just sending a letter. That's quick. And you could get money and accept money through being a qualified donee while you wait to set up this community foundation.
Yes, that's enough.
And then Alan can find money so you can get a fundraiser to help you with that broader strategy.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thank you, Sharon.
I just want to, oh, sorry, Trea, is it okay if I just respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Cognizant of time. Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Sharon. I think that is part of the idea and one of the reasons why we sort of set some funds aside to establish community funds and to match and stretch community funds. Because as long as there is a qualified donee within an Indigenous community, that fund can then pay said dividends to that qualified.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is the priority. The growing of the establishment of a community foundation proper is the longer term vision and dream for, at least for myself.
For sure. Okay, so we're going to wrap things up here. So if there is any other questions or questions that you have, if you could please send them to indigenous.philanthropy20@gmail.com. I will also be sending out a thank you and a moving forward as to what you would like to see. Is there specific requests for information that should be shared in these webinars? And the next webinar is going to be on October the 22nd with some new guest speakers. And I'll be sending you all out an invitation to join us then as well. So I just want to thank everybody today for taking the time on your Thursday afternoon to be a part of this exciting discussion. And I look forward to networking and engaging more and really pushing, or not pushing, but really embracing and moving forward with Indigenous philanthropy. Oh, there you go.
Applause, applause. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chief Smoke, Craig Blacksmith, Alan Goddard, Trea StormHunter, and Kesab Tapa, who all played critical roles to make this successful. Bravo on our first webinar, and thank you so much for your inputs, everyone. And we'll be having another webinar in next month, so stay tuned. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Chief Smoke and Craig, for being the guest speakers. And thank you, Alan, for being a guest speaker today, and for everybody that joined. There was a lot of names to go through. So everybody enjoy your Thursday. Have a fabulous weekend, and I'll be following everything up with an email. Okay, bye-bye.